I'm Andrea Carmen. I'm the Executive Director of the International Indian Treaty Council and a citizen of the Yaqui Nation. And I would like for the other two panelists to also introduce themselves before I start with the first presentation. Thank you very much. Chairman?
My name is Peter Yucupicio. I'm the chairman of the Pascua tribe, and greetings from everybody here on the reservation and the tribe to all our members throughout the world, all our indigenous people throughout every single nation. Many blessings. May this be a great panel and great dialogue on trying to figure out this mechanism. So thank you.
Kristen?
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Kristen Carpenter from the University of Colorado, and I recently served for 5 years on the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as its member from North America. And it was in that capacity that I had the opportunity to work closely with Chairman Yucupicio and Andrea Carmen on an important repatriation matter that I think they'll both talk about. And I'm happy to chime in a little bit about too. So thanks very much. It's a pleasure to join you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who's listening. And we hope to have some time at the end for some dialogue, some questions, but also your own ideas about what we can do to further this work and make it more systematic and have our rights be recognized for international repatriation. I am going to start as the first speaker and show a PowerPoint. So maybe Colleen can bring that up. And I wasn't able to figure out how to share it from my screen with this complicated and sophisticated system that is in place here. Very much appreciated, though. So I'm going to ask Colleen to share it. And it's using this system, it's small unless you press those arrows, those 4 arrows at the top that say full screen, then you will be able to see it in its full glory. So I will just start with talking about the significance of what you all know, I'm sure, is the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples on September 13th, 2007. It took us 30 years to achieve this for lots of reasons, including it's the only UN standard that specifically is based on collective rights. Of course, we have individual rights as human beings, and they are recognized in the UN Declaration. But more importantly, we have collective rights, including our collective relationships to our culture, our ceremonies, and our sacred items. These are not matters of individual property. They're collective and intergenerational in their importance and their spiritual integrity on their own. So this is reflected in the UN Declaration. You can see this is the General Assembly the day it was adopted. All the green letters are the countries that voted in favor. There were only 4 against, unfortunately, including the United States. But of course, they've since reversed their position, and no country now opposes the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I had the honor to be there in person to see the culmination of work that I had kids and grandkids born during the process. Next slide, please. The declaration itself says it's the minimum standard in Article 43, and we kept this. Some of the countries wanted to take it out when it turned out to be pretty good, but we said no. The minimum standard means that this is not the ceiling, but it's the floor, and it's a floor we never had to stand on before, a solid floor recognizing our rights in the international arena. Next slide, please. I'm just going to say a moment about inherent rights, because back in 1948, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, by the General Assembly in the United Nations. And of course, we weren't there at the time as Indigenous peoples, but it talked about the inherent dignity and inalienable rights, which means rights as a basic principle recognized internationally can't be given or taken away. They can be violated or they can be upheld. So when we had a chance to include in the preamble what we thought our inherent rights were, we talked about our political and economic and social structure, as well as our culture, spiritual traditions, philosophies, our lands, territories, and resources were all part of this collective bundle of rights that made up our inherent rights. We don't think that anybody, any declaration or law or constitution or convention or treaty gives rights, but the rights belong to us. They're inherent because the Creator put us on our traditional lands to live in the ways that he instructed us to. So that's the basis of the UN Declaration and the conversation we're having today. Next slide, please. The UN Declaration, I don't need to read all these. I'm sure you have, each of you, your pocket copy of the UN Declaration to refer to. But Article 12 upholds cultural rights and our rights to sacred sites. Next slide. Article 31 upholds our right to maintain, control, protect, and develop our cultural heritage and traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions, including seeds and knowledge of flora and fauna. There's a picture of my husband teaching one of our younger tribal members how to protect the plants on our land from a lunar eclipse. So this is part of our knowledge about our food sovereignty. Next slide, please. The restitution and return of cultural property is affirmed in Article 11, that we have that right, and to develop mechanisms in conjunction with the countries concerned. Next slide. Article 12 is very important to us, and it's one that we've used on our repatriation struggle, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But it's very important because it also recognizes the right to repatriation of ceremonial objects and human remains that were taken without free prior informed consent and in conjunction with the Indigenous peoples concerned. Next slide. And also the UN Declaration recognizes in Article 12 that we have the right to the return of these items, not only that were taken without our consent, which is a little hard to prove 100 years later, but in violation of our traditions, laws, and customs. It recognizes we have our own laws that govern how our sacred items need to be treated and where they should be. When we were working in 2004 on the UN World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, we also were able to get the whole General Assembly to accept that it says we commit ourselves. That means the countries, and there were no objections or abstentions. They said, in conjunction with Indigenous people concerned, to develop fair, transparent, and effective mechanisms for access to and repatriation of ceremonial objects and human remains at the national and international level. So that gave a big boost to our efforts in this area of our work. Next slide, please. We got resolutions from the UN Expert Mechanism on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. Peter was one of the speakers at both panels at both UN bodies, but they all called on UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, to take the lead in this work. And I will admit to you, this has been a big stumbling block for us. They did invite me for the first time to invite an Indigenous person to address the treaty body for the 1970 UNESCO Treaty on prohibiting and preventing the illicit transport of cultural property Have to excuse me, the UN loves these long names, in 2016, and I presented about the need for them to implement a new mechanism in order to make it easy for us to even find our items, let alone get them returned if they need to be. Next slide, please. We referenced a couple of the articles which seem to fit perfectly our needs, to introduce a certificate which ascertains that international transport is authorized by the owners of the cultural property in question. Next slide. Article 12 or 13 says that they will ensure that the services that they have ensure the restitution of illicitly exported cultural property to its rightful owner. And I asked him at that time, what do they mean by illicit? It means unlawful. And they said they don't really have a definition. And I said, good, because the UN Declaration recognizes Indigenous peoples' laws as well. And that needs to be part of the consideration here. Anyway, I made that point to them. I don't know if it's sunk in or not. Next slide. They also came up in 2017 with a policy to implement the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So it seems like that that should kind of do the trick for us in furthering this mechanism through UNESCO. Next slide. We made specific recommendations, and I would like, for you to take these in, because they are also open to other recommendations as well. But we would like to see how they're going to implement their policy on the UN Declaration in terms of implementing this convention and making sure Indigenous peoples participate in that process. We asked for them to organize seminars with the UN expert mechanism and other bodies, and especially Indigenous peoples from around the world, to talk about what we need in this new mechanism, what would make it viable and respectful for us, including taking our protocols into account, that they would host the establishment of a new database and encourage states to post information on the items that they have. And we need to see how we can control the access to those, because a lot of us don't want everybody to know about our sacred items. And there's a lot of different ways we've thought, maybe give a code to each Indigenous people or country. But so many Indigenous peoples have said to me as I go around talking about this work that, well, we know they took our ghost shirt, they took our treaty pipe, they took the remains, that were buried in this burial ground, but we don't even know where they took them. We don't know where they are. So that's one of the big stumbling blocks. And that also we're asking them to adopt a new regulation based on their treaty, that when anyone's trying to travel through airports, say with an Indigenous item, they would need some kind of proof in their hand. Yes, my grandmother gifted this to her friend, or, whatever it might say. Or maybe it's an item that, is okay for them to have. It's not sacred. It's, cultural, but they were able to purchase it or, be gifted it. And the model we're looking for is after CITES, which is the Endangered Species Act. You can't get through any airport in the world with an African elephant tusk in your bag. You need proof of even eagle feathers and other things like that you're authorized to have those things. So something along those lines. And this is based on input from many, many Indigenous peoples. 4 simple points, not expensive, not requiring a big new department, but, to start with a basis for our further discussion. Next slide, please. I know Peter's going to talk more about this, and so will Kristen. But an example of why we need a mechanism has been our struggle for the repatriation of our sacred Maaso Kova ceremonial deer head. Maaso Kova is a literal translation for deer head in Yaqui, and through an invitation of the Samis, the Indigenous peoples of Norway, Finland, and Sweden was invited back in 2003 to attend an event there for Indigenous Peoples Day. And it was in the bottom of this museum. And we went upstairs to look at all the items, and they have a lot of them, you know, things they shouldn't have. And I was so shocked to see our sacred deer head, which was, you can tell by the wrappings and the markings, it had also been used in ceremony. So it becomes a living being for us. It's alive. I told them it's a political prisoner in this glass cage. You know, it was shocking and so saddening for me, just as a Yaqui woman, let alone, you know, when we informed our cultural leaders, you know, that I had been discovered in. And I remember in some of the years of dialogue, and my comadre Mary Jane is there with Peter, with Chairman. We had a conference call with them in Peter's office, and they said, well, because of the controversy, it's not on display anymore. We took it out of the glass case. And comadre Mary Jane, one of our elders, says, well, why do you need it then? You know, I thought that was pretty classic. Next slide. This is just an example of the letter of one of our cultural leaders who wrote to them right away as soon as I came back and informed them. And he said in his letter that the Yaqui people can suffer. We can be harmed if this item is not treated in the way that it was meant to be. And we thought that would do the trick, you know, but, you know, here it is. It's 18 years later. Next slide. This is just one of many meetings we have. There's Peter in the middle. The United States State Department was very helpful in facilitating. The Swedish government, right to Peter's side, is Secretary of Culture, for Secretary of State for Culture, they call him. And then also the Sami Parliament government, the indigenous government, were all very supportive. And they told us that day that as long as the museum, which is a government museum, agrees to return the Maaso Kova, that they would support, you know, no questions asked. It hasn't turned out that way quite yet, but we'll get to that in a minute. Next slide. Because of the lack of movement, even after all those things, our Yaqui traditional leaders in Mexico established a by country, I guess, across border Maaso Kova Repatriation Committee in 2019, and cultural leaders from here in Arizona, as well as from our traditional communities in Rio Yaqui, Sonora, Mexico, came together in recognition of our common cultural bonds, common ceremonial practices, and decided that we would work together for the return of the Maaso Kova. That's a traditional meeting, it shows, in Rio Yaqui, conducted all in Yaqui with our cultural leaders and political leaders. Next slide. It was very important that at this point, the government of Mexico also supported that this item belonged to the Yaquis. They had no claim over it. However, they've offered to assist in any way that they can to get it into the Yaquis' hands again. And this is a letter from INPI, which is the National Institute of Indigenous Peoples, affirming that this item must be returned to the cultural leaders as the government of Mexico, which was very important. So we had support both from the US side and the Mexico side, because we are a nation that, as you probably know, is divided by the Mexico and US border, but we are the same nation, same people, same culture, and same commitment for the return of the Maaso Kova. Next slide, please. You'll hear from Kristen in a minute. She was the chair of the MRIP, and it was very important to us that they accepted at our petition to take this on as part of their country engagement process. And I know she'll talk about this, to bring the Yaquis together with the International Indian Treaty Council and the government of Sweden, the museum in particular, to try to resolve this issue based on the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and also the recognition of the Yaqui laws that said that this item cannot be outside of our community. We need to take care of our Sailamaso, our little brother, the deer, in the proper cultural and ceremonial way. Next slide. So I'm getting to the end. This is, this was a very important event, because not only was it where we actually carried out this country engagement with the government of Sweden's museum, with cultural leaders and ceremonial participants from both Mexico and US, Yaquis, and there's me as well. But at the same time, they held the first ever expert group meeting and conference on international repatriation. And we really felt, in a way, in our hearts, that even though the Maaso Kova hadn't come home, that he held himself back in some ways so that a mechanism could be put in place, and that force that we had built for the repatriation of the Maaso Kova could be used to help Indigenous peoples from every part of the world that are going through these same struggles. Next slide. And the outcomes of that were that the recognition of Indigenous laws were part of the result that the MREP put forward. This first seminar took place, and I hope we'll have more. Also, it was very important, the development of these stronger relationships between the Yaqui ceremonial leaders and participants on the Arizona side and Mexico side. I hate even to say side, because as Peter has famously said, the land is ours and the border is theirs. But anyway, we are in two countries now. And amazingly, the Swedish Museum finally agreed to begin the long-awaited process for repatriation of the Maaso Kova. We're still waiting for that to happen. They said because of COVID and political issues, we have not gone over to collect the Maaso Kova, that transfer will take place in the Mexican consulate, the Mexican embassy in Stockholm, with us present, of course. And then the Mexican government has agreed officially and in writing to turn it over right then and there into the care and with the correct protocols carried forth by our cultural leaders. Next slide. I just want to give you a couple of current updates, and this happened just last month. The United Nations Human Rights Council, which is made up of countries of the world, the United States just rejoined after who took them out of the Human Rights Council as a member. But this resolution on rights of Indigenous peoples included paragraph 22, which encourages the development of a process to facilitate the international repatriation of Indigenous peoples' sacred items and human remains in cooperation with Indigenous peoples through UNESCO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, the Expert Mechanism on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Special Rapporteur, the Permanent Forum, a huge international force to bring this about. And this just happened last month through our efforts. And it's very important to move this process forward for all Indigenous peoples facing this struggle. Next slide. This is my final slide. I think we still have challenges, which we don't have a consistent way to identify where our items are held. We still have the burden of proof. We have to show them that, our peoples are the rightful recipients of these items. They don't have to prove how they stole it or why they have it, but we have to prove why we should get it back. Collectors see that these items were fairly acquired. The Swedish Museum kept maintaining they acquired it legally, even though they couldn't really explain what laws they used to pilfer it from basically what were prisoners of war. We were still in combat then with the Mexican government in the 30s when they got it. And they tend to still see items as artifacts from dead cultures, past cultures, rather than items from still living cultures, or in the case of the Maaso Kova, a living being itself. And now, even though it's been agreed to have this new mechanism, we're still waiting to see how it's going to be housed and developed and funded as well, even though we hope to have not too much funding be needed for it. Next slide. We still are waiting for the return, as I said. We know that this is going to happen. We're confident that the Maaso Kova will come home to our peoples. It'll be brought to the spiritual societies in Mexico, but I know all of us will be there at that moment. But I just want to say one additional development. I just got back from the COP26, the climate change talks at the UN in Glasgow. And Glasgow, Scotland was one of the major ports for trade with the Americas, for cotton, for tobacco. They were the big source for all of Europe of tobacco. So we know that they also have Indigenous peoples' sacred items there. And the mayor of Glasgow came and announced to the Indigenous Caucus that they have an open door policy going forward. Any items that should not be there that are from Indigenous peoples, they will engage in a repatriation process with no questions asked. So despite some of the roadblocks and the slowness of this process, we do see that there is a change in attitude in many, many places around the world. And we look forward to making the new mechanism a reality so that these things will not take so long and not be so difficult for Indigenous peoples. Thank you, Chokwe Utesia.
Andrea, thank you. And would Chairman like to go next since he's available now? I'd be happy to go last if you'd like.
Sure, happy to join. As you know, Andrea explained everything on mechanisms and everything else. But part of my involvement was once she came and brought the Maaso Kova here, and for us, it's just like it's a piece of our heart and our life. Ever since time immemorial for us, the sacred deer dance has been part of our lives, and there are many tribes that have items like a samurai sword, like a piece of hair lock, maybe even carvings, things like that are so sacred that they only belong in a setting. And for us, it's a setting of either a rite of passage to death, to life, ceremonial belief after Christianity and all that. There's a division between what Christianity is and what our traditional way of observing our creator up there through the deer dance. She is one of the only individuals in our life and belief that can travel from the material world here to the spirit world and visit our people that are still there in the spirit world. So with that, we start thinking about how do we protect these? Will the mechanism someday come to be? How do we get states to agree to have dialogue and have communication with each other and work on these agreements to try and fulfill those things for the tribes? For us, I think it's an amazing thing that when Andrea brought it, and we'll not forget the Sami Nation that recognize that I believe that belongs to you. There are many items in Yaqui that are made and created, and until it's used in a ceremony, then it becomes a little bit more sacred and it becomes a part of our life forever, not just while it's used, forever. For instance, I belong to the Chapayeca Society, which makes masks out of skin. And a lot of these masks, nobody can wear that mask except for that person that created it. Those masks are offered in a fire in the end of the runs during Easter, and they're offered with all your power, all your thought, all your way of life, the promise and the reasons why you're making that sacrifice. And to this day, I see the Maaso Kova as the same way. Even though our members that were in Tlaxcala in the 1930s and were there to serve other parts of what then became Mexico, it was still amazing that our tribal members still did not forget who they were. Even with guns probably surrounding them, being held in camps, they still managed to do a ceremony. They still managed to do their offerings to our Creator in their own Yaqui way. And that's what's impressive about that Maaso Kova. Maybe they didn't have all the tools, and maybe they didn't have all the things that they would have in the traditional homeland, but they still made one to be able to serve our Creator. That's what's amazing about the Maaso Kova that's there. It has already been used. It has always been part of our ceremonies for thousands of years before the story of Christianity in what is now northern Mexico, the Sonora area, all the way to what became America in the states of Arizona, California, New Mexico, Texas, all that region right there, that whole circle on the Sea of Cortez is where this Yaqui Nation and the tribe has always existed. For us, I think it's an amazing, amazing thing that even now our youth participate with so many electronic things, with so many things, with Palm Pilots and iPhones and all that. We still have members of our societies and our communities that still do the deer dance, the matachini dancing, the chapayeca, all the maestros and the altar societies and all that. When I speak to you, I don't speak to you because of me. I speak to you because that is the way it has been for hundreds and thousands of years for us to protect the most sacred. And for us, I think when Andrea brought it, we took it to our elder senior center. We brought it to our Yom Teki Museum, and they all gave us the permission and direction to see if we could have it brought back. And where it belongs, not even I, as chairman of the Pascua Yaqui tribe, have the right to say where it belongs. It belongs to that deer dance ceremonial society, and especially the ones from the 8 villages in Sonora called the Rio Yaqui area. They have helped us out, like Andrea said, formed this Maaso Kova committee that has been stronger and stronger in dealing with the Kovanals, the leadership, governors, as they call them in Sonora, but it's those cultural members that are from the Deer Dance Society that will accept this, and then they should decide what way of disposal, or where they keep it at, or how sacred they want to continue taking care of it. We are all entrusted in taking care of this land, this water, this air, your family. And that's what we're trying to do with this repatriation of the Maaso Kova. I know that there are many, many sacred items for a lot of American, a lot of European, a lot of South American tribes. And we must not give up. We must not forget who we are in spite of all the industrialization, the new digital years, and the new everything that's brand new now didn't exist 100 years ago. But we still exist, and we cannot forget how to take care of our own, our families, our people, our sacred items. It is us to keep that faith and keep going and keep making sure, if you are from a certain indigenous, whether you're Chinese, you're Japanese, you're South American, you're Cuban, you're Jamaican, you're Yaqui, you're Mohegan, always refer back to your ancestry and make sure you take care of those things that were put in your hands, in your heart, and in your life to take care of. And with that, I thank this panel, the UN, and hopefully we'll get that mechanism someday, and the repatriation, committee and that office that we all help each other. We must continue this work on fighting to repatriate a lot of these things that are in museums, that are being in private sales and all that. We thank you, Shannon, and thank you, everybody, Kristen and Andrea. It's been actually a real big honor to serve with you and try to keep this fight going in spite of COVID. We must now heal ourselves and get back to this way of life and protecting our nations throughout this planet and globally look at each other as brothers to each other to protect these sacred items. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocotesia, compadre chairman. I would like to now turn the floor to our last speaker, Kristen Carpenter, and then they'll help us open it up for questions and your views on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Chairman Yucupicio. It really has been my pleasure and honor to get to know you both through this process. I've learned so much. I thank you for your hospitality when I've visited in Arizona, and hope to be back when the Maaso Kova is coming home. I am going to try to share my screen, even though I haven't used this platform before. So bear with me for 1 second. I hope I can do it. Andrea, can you see the screen?
I can. You just have to push the arrows so it gets big.
How is it now?
Not big. Oh, I think, you know what? I think we each have to do it from our end. And so everybody, please make the PowerPoint full screen. Yes, now it is. You have to do it on your own computers. Thank you.
I can no longer see you, but I am going to proceed.
Okay.
And Andrea, please stop me if something goes wrong with the audio or visual.
Okay.
So as Andrea and Peter both said, I did serve on the UN's expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples for 5 years as the member from North America. And I'm going to reflect on my experiences there and my thoughts on developing an international mechanism for repatriation. I should say that my term on MRIP ended in May, so I'm no longer speaking in my MRIP capacity, but more as a scholar and member of the community. So I think the critical question here from a big picture is whose law and whose voice matters internationally in cultural property protection. And the traditional answer to that question is that it has been the law and the voices of nation states, of state governments. And that's certainly the case under the main treaty, the Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and so on, ownership of cultural property, that has governed most cases for repatriation and restitution in this space. And I think Andrea already mentioned that this treaty and many national laws have a definition of illicit import, meaning illegal import, export, or transfer that depend on, again, state laws and don't take into account Indigenous peoples' own laws, traditions, and customs. And this matters a great deal because there's this whole infrastructure set up under international law for state-to-state repatriation. And I just pulled a few articles out of this convention, but one of them that's important is Article 13, providing for restitution of illicitly exported cultural property to the rightful owner. Now, this too is what Indigenous peoples are often seeking, but this convention doesn't usually reflect their interests and values, and it doesn't give them a seat at the table. And so what we end up with is, in the best case scenario, a regime of state-to-state repatriations. And in the international arena, when we're talking about states, we mean nation states, not like Massachusetts and Colorado, but like Sweden and France. And so it is national governments and national leaders who do have a seat at the table when it comes to these most precious things, and if even living beings, as Chairman said, with respect to the Maaso Kova and claims for repatriation. And so this example where the United States negotiated with Finland to return artifacts, cultural objects taken from Mesa Verde in the 1800s, on one hand, a really wonderful example. and not to be terribly political, but in my view, probably one of the best things that President Trump did during his time. But on the other hand, when I look at this picture, I think, well, what's missing from this picture? And what's missing is Indigenous peoples at the table. Luckily, in the United States, we do have NAGPRA, and so we know when the national government possesses Indigenous peoples' cultural objects and human remains, there's already an expectation and a legal requirement that they will be repatriated. But state governments may not know the entirety of Indigenous peoples' concerns about these items, and in many countries, there is no NAGPRA. And so if a state tries to represent Indigenous peoples in repatriation matters under the UNESCO convention, it may not necessarily result in repatriation to them, but to the national government, which could mean the items are then kept in a national museum or studied, but don't go back to the Indigenous peoples. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as Andrea said, intervenes in this status quo. And it recognizes that Indigenous peoples have their own rights, cultural rights and religious freedoms to repatriation of cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property, taken not only in a way that might violate national laws, but also in violation of their own laws, traditions, and customs. And these are really important recognitions of Indigenous peoples' rights in a way that, if brought to bear on repatriation under the UNESCO Convention, or if brought to bear in a new mechanism, could make a tremendous difference. And the Declaration itself envisions that states, like our own, the United States, and the UN system itself, so these are Articles 28 and 41, and other articles, I should say, will take measures to achieve these substantive provisions, and will also ensure that Indigenous peoples are able to participate in the achievement of the ends of the Declaration. So having laid out some of the law, I'd just like to reflect on the MRIP's involvement in the Yaqui request for assistance with repatriation of the Maaso Kova, and what that experience taught me in terms of important aspects of developing an international mechanism. And I hope I won't repeat anything that Chairman and Andrea have said, but I will make a few points. So the expert mechanism has a relatively new mandate from the Human Rights Council from 2016.
Hey, Kristen.
Yes.
Hi. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I'm just wondering if we're supposed to be seeing your slides. We only see the cover slide.
Ah, okay. It's not advancing then, I see.
No.
Well, I don't know how to do that then. I'm advancing on my end.
I'm going to help you. If you want to stop sharing, I'm going to pull this up for you and just let me know what slide to start on.
Okay, let's see. Could you go back a couple of slides?
I'm not sharing yet. You are still sharing.
Ah, interesting. Okay, let's see if I can stop sharing.
There
How's
you go.
that?
Okay, now I will start sharing.
Okay.
Thank you.
In the UN, we often talk about interactive dialogue. So this is an interactive dialogue, which I appreciate. So the slide I would love to start on, and I'm sorry you all didn't see the text of the convention and the declaration, but I suppose that's okay. But the slide I'd love to start on is the one, it's a group of people standing at the United Nations with a Brazilian Indigenous person at the center.
I'm sorry, it's just taking a second.
Okay.
I hope that it'll be this one. Wrong one.
Those are Andrea's.
Yeah. Okay. One more second. Sorry about this, everyone. We'll get it. Okay, here we go.
Okay, great. So if you scroll through these, maybe people can connect them to things. Here's the international convention I mentioned that's about states' rights, basically, and obligations. And then next slide. This is this example of state-to-state repatriation. Continue. Here are the relevant provisions of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Andrea already mentioned some of these. Next slide. Okay, I think we were missing one in the middle, but let's just go from here since we've lost some time already. So in 2016, the Yaqui people, through the International Indian Treaty Council, and Andrea already mentioned Yomentekia, and eventually the Maaso Kova Committee, made a request to the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which has a mandate to help states and Indigenous peoples realize the aims of the Declaration. And given that the Declaration's Articles 11 and 12 provide for Indigenous peoples' rights to repatriation, but that the government of Sweden had not yet responded to the Yaqui requests, the MRIP thought that this was an appropriate request to take. Diplomatically, we had to engage in a process of inviting, I should say, the state of Sweden to participate in a process of dialogue and development of advice. And eventually, after some years of conversations and development of the record, the government of Sweden did come to the table. It first articulated this position that you see here on the slide, which was that the Maaso Kova had not been acquired illicitly, that it was legally acquired from its owners in Mexico, and so therefore there was no case for repatriation. And I think this goes to the point that we've probably all raised, that when the definition of illicit is tied to state laws or international laws, it doesn't necessarily reflect the laws, customs, and traditions of Indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. And so a real, oh, I see the slides are now out of order. You can go to the next slide. Okay, in my view, a real breakthrough in this matter was when the Yaqui participants did describe their own laws, customs, and traditions on the Maaso Kova, which included, and this is a quote from the MRIP technical advice note, that it could not, as a consecrated deerhead, be purchased, gifted, alienated to anybody who is not in the society entrusted to take care of it. And this was important substantively because it meant that the events that the museum had recounted about the acquisition probably did not meet the standards of Yaqui law. But it was also important from a diplomatic perspective because Sweden was very concerned about following its own laws and making sure that its obligations as a custodian to collections, its fiduciary responsibility to members of the public, that it was meeting all of those legal requirements. But I think that once Sweden heard that the Yaquis had their own laws on treating the Maaso Kova, and they had the very sacred duties and obligations of their own, this allowed the parties, at least in my view, as the person who was facilitating the dialogue, to respect each other's positions in a more meaningful way. Next slide, please. And so as Andrea and Peter have mentioned, we did wind up with an agreement in principle to repatriate. Andrea mentioned that it does acknowledge Yaqui people's laws along with the state laws. It also calls for the UNESCO Convention to be interpreted consistent with the UN Declaration, which I think is also a very critical breakthrough of this event. And if anybody would like to read the full version, the MRIP's technical advice note is available on the MRIP website. So too is MRIP's study on repatriation issues more broadly. And if you'll go to the next slide. The study that we prepared, Repatriation of Ceremonial Objects and Human Remains, and it should say, and intangible cultural property under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is meant to identify the many gaps in existing law and processes for Indigenous peoples repatriation, and to call for some of the things that might be important for an international mechanism. And I'll just highlight some of those and then conclude. So as Andrea mentioned, the logical place for such a mechanism, although not the only place, could be within UNESCO, which is the UN's education, social, scientific, and cultural organization. And UNESCO's mandate does concern culture. UNESCO has a focal point on Indigenous peoples. But so far, UNESCO has not really picked up the opportunity to create a process or a mechanism to facilitate Indigenous peoples repatriation. So it doesn't necessarily have to be there, but it should be somewhere within the UN system. I would like to see it, of course, take into account Indigenous peoples' own laws, customs, and traditions, because this is such a critical aspect of what's missing in the Convention on the Illicit Trafficking of Cultural Property. And I would also like to see this mechanism function in cooperation with states, but recognize that Indigenous peoples' rights to repatriation are in their own capacities. Through their own representative institutions. These are not rights that are derivative of states' interests in Indigenous peoples' own cultural, spiritual, and religious properties. And this too could be a sea change in diplomacy, because as we saw earlier, when Indigenous peoples try to advance these claims, they often don't have the leverage or the access to state governments that would really help to move these along. I can talk in greater detail about any of these points, but I think with our technical glitches and so on, I will conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Andrea, did you want to follow up with anything? You're muted. We still can't hear you. Or I can't hear you. Can everyone else hear her?
No.
We still can't hear you, Andrea. Well, then let's move to the questions. I'm not sure what's happening, but hopefully we can get that fixed. Nobody can hear you, Andrea.
Yeah. Andrea, you're still not on. You may need to refresh your page or reconnect your mic because it's showing you're not muted, but we're not hearing you. Hit your refresh button, which is going to pop you out and pop you back in. So the refresh button on your browser. Let's see if that helps. It's the little thing that's like an arrow in a circle up top. Yeah. All right.
All right. Well, we do have one question in the chat we can go to, and hopefully Andrea will join us. There she is.
Here I am.
And we can hear you.
Oh, wow. Okay. Guy, you're a genius. Thank you. I just wanted to add one thing. And this, I think, was very important when we were getting in the weeds with Sweden about this illicit issue. Not only, that we were able to present our own laws about the Maaso Kova, which didn't comport very well with their story of how it was acquired. But also, this was documented, and very historically well documented, that it was taken from Yaquis that, as Peter referred to, were basically prisoners of war, about 1,000 miles. And this is a well-known history, how the Mexican government enslaved and forcibly removed about 6,000 Yaquis and put them all over Mexico, Yucatan, building roads and just a lot of places. And this particular group in the state of Tlaxcala had actually escaped from Yucatan, and we're basically being held there under the control of the Mexican army. And the anthropologists that so-called collected the Maaso Kova took pictures, including showing armed soldiers standing around, the ceremonial participants, including the deer dancer. So, looking at the history of colonization, brutal colonization in many places, where items were taken from indigenous peoples under conditions of war. Um, and as political prisoners, and but this is a very well documented history about the Yaquis, from the late 1800s through the 1930s. And we had affidavits from an elder who had been a very young boy there, about how his dad said that they were forced to dance and all of these things. And this kind of, I felt, made them realize that their argument about legal acquisition couldn't be applied in this case any more than the Nazis could say that, even though their laws said it was okay to take the Jewish people to concentration camps and confiscate everything, that all those paintings and things that they took from the Jewish people were somehow legally acquired. The whole condition of warfare, and how indigenous peoples were the victims of violence, in conjunction with the confiscation of our cultural sacred property, threw another issue into this that I think is worth highlighting, because it happened to so many people. That their items were taken. How can that be legal? How can that be considered not illicit, when the Yaquis that were the victims here were prisoners of war of the Mexican government? Anyway, I just wanted to bring that up as another issue that I think should be considered when we're discussing what's illicit and what's not illicit. Thank you. I think that we have some time for some questions or comments. Colleen, and you're going to chair that part.
Yes, sure. Let's put all three of you on the stage. And I will show the question, and I'll also read it, and then you're free to respond. And also, just to the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A if you have them. This question comes from Shannon O'Loughlin, the CEO and attorney with the association. How could an international mechanism be enforced? Or is this a mechanism that some consider more aspirational or a good practice?
I can maybe answer that myself, since we've been thinking about this for a very long time. We have, which I tried to show, and I didn't even show all of them, so many decisions that were adopted by the states, the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, the UN Declaration, etc., that affirms this right. What we're looking for, I think, is more of a process. It's an agreed process. We think that even though UNESCO tends to view property as state property, You know, if an indigenous people's sacred item came from that country, it's got to be returned to that country. And that's why Sweden is holding us to that. And that's why Mexico's cooperation is important in this regard, even though they've made it clear that they have no claim on this item and it will be right away turned over. So it's just kind of a change of hands. But we are looking right now for more of a process with recognition of existing rights already in place. We just basically need, you know, a mechanism or a process. It's the kind of interchangeable. I mean, nothing in the UN, even legally binding conventions, are enforceable, you know, if states don't want to do them. So we're hoping that, you know, with the change of attitude, and now the Human Rights Council is made up of states, and they just adopted a resolution saying that this process should go forward. So we're hoping that we have a buy-in from a lot of states, and it was adopted by consensus. Like I said, there wasn't a vote or any objections, that we can move forward for putting this in place with an acceptance of international law already there.
Andrea, may I
Kristen,
chime in for a
yeah,
second?
no, I was saying, Kristen, you probably
Yeah.
have something to say on this too.
Yeah, I do. And, you know, one thing that I learned a lot about during my time at the UN is that in the United States, especially as lawyers, we think in terms of legal enforcement. And if it doesn't come in the form of statutory remedies, it's almost like it doesn't exist for us. But the modality that is effective and operational at the United Nations is diplomacy. And it is states, but also indigenous peoples and NGOs and so on, using pressure, negotiation, influence, not coercion in the sense of enforcement, but those diplomatic levers to encourage one another to do the right thing. And Andrea is absolutely right that that can operate by means of agreement. I mean, nobody has the power to force any country to do anything it doesn't want to, unless we're talking about the Security Council and military measures. Obviously, we're not talking about that here. But I think there is developing a worldwide consensus, as Andrea said, that cultural property is taken not only from indigenous peoples, but from African nations and elsewhere during periods of conquest and colonization, were inappropriately taken. And this is a worldwide problem that deserves attention. And it actually behooves states and museums and others to enter into a process like this. Another thing that I thought was really revealing, and Andrea and Peter, I don't know if you noticed it too, but when Sweden and the Swedish Museum said, you know what, we want to be a leader in the human rights approach to repatriation. And I was like, wow, that is so great. I couldn't have said it any better. And I think lots of other states, France and so on, are realizing they have an opportunity, a moral imperative, and a diplomatic responsibility, I guess, to meet the expectations of the world community along these lines.
Thank you both. Chairman, did you want to add anything to that question?
No, just I think they're spot on. And you know, when I looked at what Kristen said about, you know, them stating that, you know, to be there and hear that was amazing. After all the years of struggle, it was no, 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 and all of a sudden, change of heart. And that was an amazing thing to witness myself. I actually got into tears once I said that because, you know, it's so passionate about this sacred item, and it brought me to tears actually, that someday, somewhere, somehow, some mechanism in their heart, their brain, their state, their nation was changing a little bit, and hopefully it'll keep changing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I just like to make another comment, because this issue of what's illicit is so big in this process. Actually, Sweden at the end of the day said, in spite of everything we presented, our own laws, which were violated. Of course, the fact that these were political prisoners in a warfare situation, all of these things, they still didn't want to, come away from their position that they legally acquired it, even though they could never produce whatever law they were operating under. But they finally said that they would return it. We could get away from that discussion and cut through to them being willing to return it for ethical and humanitarian reasons, as Kristen referred to. And that may be, a channel that we can take, because we, as the wronged parties, whose rights have been violated, and even goes further than that. I mean, we were slaughtered, and killed and forcibly relocated all around the time of their acquisition of the Masakova. But, we really want them to accept the blame and admit, but maybe they won't. And I know their lawyers are advising them, well, we might sue them, or I don't know what. But, everyone's always worried about admitting to breaking laws, whosever laws they are. But the fact that we all agreed, we all said, okay, that works for us. Let's move to repatriation based on humanitarian ethical grounds. They heard our point of how we were suffering, how important this is to us. That might be another consideration for others that are working on these issues, even though, yeah, we think they acquired it illegally. We thought that was clear, but they couldn't admit it. But to facilitate the return, we joined them in moving away from that discussion and moving into another level of communication. And yeah, Peter said we were all crying. They were crying. The Swedish Museum people were crying, and we were crying. And, it was like, wow, something shifted here. Something definitely shifted. And it wasn't just because Sweden has become the international pariah of the repatriation movement over the Masakova, but, suddenly I think it touched their hearts that they could get on the right side.
Yeah, and I have another comment, and I think through these efforts, I don't know if everybody's aware on this panel, but we had the president of Mexico do an apology to the Yaqui Nation in it's called the Plan de Justicia, the justice plan for the indigenous, the injustices and everything they've done to our Yaqui communities in Rio Yaqui. He himself went down there and apologized for all the injustices. And right now, I think it's a good place in our lives to try to get this finished and get Mexico to accept it and turn it into their authorities there, because he said he would continue in the next 2-3 years to keep the momentum going on that apology he made in October, about the 28th or 29th. And then he went back on another meeting about a month later to follow up on all the things that he promised to the indigenous nation there of the Yaqui people, our people. And I thought that was an amazing thing when you start looking at Mexico is now turning the corner on trying to help, especially the Yaqui community. And it would help the Maaso Kova and all the mechanisms and all that a nation or a state like that, like Mexico, would even go that far in apologizing for all the injustices. So that is happening today, right now. And thanks to Adelfo and also Saul that have helped that whole movement get to this point.
Me, Gretch, thank you. We have a couple more questions in the chat. This question also comes from Shannon O'Loughlin. Has there been an example where the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has been used as diplomacy for agreement and protection of Indigenous peoples' rights?
Lots of them. Including this one, including, the repatriation and the articles in the declaration. And that's why I started there. I think that there are many examples of using the declaration to, protection of sacred sites, creation of cultural easements, I don't know if you want to answer that, Kristen, because that's what MRIP does in its country engagement. The purpose of it is to assist states in implementing the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So their engagement with Sweden and the Yaquis on this one was based on the UN Declaration and helping them to implement the UN Declaration. In this regard. So there are many examples that I can think of, but I'll turn it to Kristen. She might have related to these kinds of issues from the MRIP's point of view.
Thank you, Andrea, and thanks for the question, Shannon. So it might help, to provide a really short update on where we are in realizing the aims of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples more broadly. And that is, as we know, in 2007, the General Assembly adopted the Declaration. In 2010, the United States expressed support for it, reversing its earlier position. In 2014, all 193 member states of the United Nations agreed in the outcome document to the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples to take measures to realize the aims of the Declaration. So all 193 states, including our own United States, are now on board that we're in the era of implementing the Declaration. So how is that happening? MRIP's mandate is to work on those matters, and I'll just provide a few really quick examples. So in 2017, Mexico City, which kind of has the status of DC almost, adopted the Declaration in its own constitution, the entire Declaration. And so the Declaration is law in Mexico City. In 2019, New Zealand and the Maori people began the process of a national action plan to implement the Declaration nationwide. And then this year in 2021, at the urging of Indigenous People Canada, adopted legislation to bring its entire body of national law into alignment with the Declaration and to set up a framework for implementation. Again, here in the United States, I think we get a little bit of a skewed vision because we're so far behind, our geographical and sort of legal, countries that have similar legal traditions to our own. But the time is now, and the United States is going to get on board. I think, if I can make a short plug, we have this implementation project between the Native American Rights Fund and the University of Colorado. We published this year a 75-page document showing examples of tribes using the Declaration. The 12 tribes in Washington State negotiated with the Attorney General of Washington an agreement to use free, prior, and informed consent, citing the Declaration in all of their policies in that state. Navajo Nation has incorporated the Declaration in a lot of its work around the protection of San Francisco peaks, is now in the process of negotiating an MOU with some of the local governments. Like Andrea, I could go on and on and on with local, national, and international agreements, but I really hope that we in the United States are going to start to have more access and awareness of the potential and also just how far behind we are and how much opportunity we have to catch up. Thank you.
I'll add one more example from the recently concluded what's called the COP26, the Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where we used the UN Declaration there to create a new body which has equal standing with all of the other what they call constituted bodies under the UNFCCC, under the convention, and it is made up of half states, countries, and half representatives of Indigenous people, 7 and 7. And it's the first time in our 40 years at the United Nations that there's been direct representation in keeping with Article 18 of the UN Declaration that says representation, direct representation. The members of the MRIP, the members of the Permanent Forum, we can nominate them, but it's the state parties that select at the end of the day. Sometimes they select how we like and sometimes not. But this is the first time where each of the 7 regions selected their representative on this new body called Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, which I'm the member currently from North America, representing Indigenous peoples in U.S. and Canada. But when we got it adopted by in a couple 3 years ago by all of the parties, the state parties, they included in the resolution that it would respect the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples in its entirety. And we use that all the time there to promote an Indigenous perspective of what needs to happen to curtail climate change, respecting our rights, a rights-based approach to climate change. So that's just, I'm thinking of that because it was just a week ago that it concluded, and it was, it takes us to a whole new level in that process based on the UN Declaration and right to participation in decision making. So I'll just throw that example in.
Thank you all. We have another question in the chat. This question comes from Joyce. How can you suggest these issues become more mainstream?
Well, I can say that we need to do it. You know, whenever our tribes or organizations make a resolution. I know NCAI does this now. They kind of lagged behind the Assembly of First Nations in Canada in doing this. They cite the provisions of the UN Declaration that pertain to the specific issue, whether it's language or housing or environment or culture, you know, or tribal sovereignty, self-determination, you know, they always include it in there. So I think it's up to us to make sure the UN Declaration and all of its provisions, including addressing repatriation, becomes what's called customary international law. I mean, they say, well, it's not binding, but you look at the Universal Declaration on Human Rights from 1948, it wasn't adopted by consensus either at the General Assembly, but no country today would say that it's not binding. It's considered customary international law, and the UN Declaration can be that too. And like we're saying, there's a change in at least some of the states and some of the museums to recognize that, you know, they can stop being colonizers now and work with us to make sure that our laws are upheld and the items that shouldn't be there are returned. And we can work with them on making sure there's proper education in their museums using the items that we say are okay to be there, as long as, you know, they accept our explanation of what they are. And the exhibit that's going on right now at the Ethnographic Museum in Geneva, Switzerland, about Indigenous peoples' environmental knowledge is a good example. They have as a principle for that exhibit at the top the right to free prior informed consent. They're bringing in Indigenous peoples to talk about both their historical and their current understandings. So I think this is really an important example, and there are others as well.
Thank you. We have another question I'm going to bring up. This question comes from Melanie. Have you found that museum personnel are just as resistant to repatriation as the governmental personnel, or is the issue primarily governmental or legal?
I can just answer briefly. When we first met, we invited actually the Director General of the Swedish Museum to come to the Cultural Museum here, and we brought up cultural leaders from Mexico as well as ones from Arizona to talk to her about the Maaso Kova. It didn't work, but maybe it contributed. But she told us then kind of privately, Peter and I, that she was getting a lot of resistance from sort of the old board of directors, you know, that she was dealing with. She was a young Swedish woman, but these older Swedish men didn't want to didn't want to stop thinking about their items as, number one, their ownership now, but also like artifacts, that kind of thinking, you know, that is now part of the Swedish patrimony, you know, in the museum. So I think it's probably both. And it depends on the individual. And I think we need to find where where the soft spot is, whether it's in government officials or museum officials. We always met with the Swedish government and their diplomats. They always, oh, we understand, yes, but this and that, you know. So I don't know. I don't know the answer, but it's there. We've found some really good museum people and some good government people too in this quest that we've been on.
Chairman, did you want to chime in? I feel like I keep taking the floor, but you probably have something more meaningful to say.
No, Andrea's exactly right, but it felt like they were playing ping pong with us.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wanted to take responsibility. And that's the key thing. Who's going to take the responsibility to see this through? And then they kept blaming each other. No, it's not us, the museum. It's the government. The government has its own rules that don't mesh with our rules. So it kept going back and forth. And even now, to this day, as the museum has said that they will start the path, well, it's probably stuck somewhere in there as to, okay, well, the government let us do this. So I think that's part of the problem. But, I basically got upset with one of the ladies there in Geneva when basically said there is no way this is going anywhere. And then I started thinking of the basis of how it was acquired, whether at the first time it was gifted or whether it was purchased, and then how it was documented in their own state, in their own nation. First of all, you cannot gift that sacred item to a female. It has to be a male. I'm not being a male chauvinist or nothing, but there are certain regalia that only belong to male. There are some that belong to females, and that's how it is in our Yaqui life. The second thing is, if there was money offered or whatever, you have to figure out the disadvantage of sometimes even being in a war camp of starvation and those things. So, and even to this day, when I think about it, it still doesn't all fall into places as to how they acquired that, the anthropologists. But, in their way of quantifying that it was done with the legal way of doing it, well, the internal laws of the Yaqui, they have never, ever understood that, whether they were personnel, staff, or even government officials. But then again, if they had an item that was there in our nation here, Yaqui Nation, we would make every effort with respect to trying to see how we could, being all the right things in place, that we will return that item to them. And I don't think it's the same feeling when you start looking at, when people deal with, this is our law and we wrote this law has been here since 1500, 1800, 2100. I just think that the cultural aspect of it, that are not written laws for us, but it's just a way of life, is more important than all that paperwork that they threw at us. So that's part of the thing that I think they don't understand. Whether you're from the Cherokee Nation, Navajo Nation, you're from, an African nation, or there are laws that will never be written that will always predate everything because that's who they are. And that's the part that I think staff and states and governments don't understand.
We're probably almost out of time, but can I make a quick quick point just to follow up on what Chairman said? So I think those points are support for the need for an international mechanism, because one of the things that I have found is that, especially in Europe, where they don't have 30 years of experience dealing with NAGPRA, for example, the discourse among museum professionals is really at a starting point when it comes to Indigenous people's rights or culture or human rights. And it would be a shame if Indigenous peoples had to recreate the wheel and start this conversation, from the very beginning, every single time they have an international repatriation claim. if we could develop some best practices around speaking across disciplines. Museum folks are trained in anthropology or archaeology or museology, not necessarily human rights or indigenous culture, but it would be really wonderful to have some best practices, some common terminology, and to kind of amass that knowledge in a mechanism that could then kind of, advance things versus having to go back to the beginning every single time. So these are really valuable lessons that Andrea and Peter shared during the Maaso Kova matter, and hopefully they can be lessons, that are generalized to the whole world community.
Thank you to our panelists. We do have a few more minutes left, and I was hoping that I could get in a question that I've been wondering. And please forgive me if I misspeak. I wouldn't dream to misspeak about your sacred items, so I'll do my due diligence to try my best. But in regards to the sacred Yaqui Maaso Kova ceremonial deer head, I heard all three of you talk about how during those conversations, you basically asserted, traditional Yaqui law, correct? And am I correct in saying that? Which I think is so important for tribal nations to understand that their own laws are so important in these conversations. But I just wondered if after you've made it pretty clear that it was impossible for the chain of title to be what the museum was saying because of your own traditional laws, did their story change, or how did they receive that?
I will let you know how they received it. They formed their own committee. They took them to the museum, and they kind of like discredited us. They were very disrespectful. They also wrote, I think, in their report back that, some of them didn't agree with the way we had presented. And to this day, it kind of like, I wonder what those individuals, and I've had conversations with those individuals, and we debate. To this day, we debate with some of them because they're my friends too in the Rio Yaqui area. And one of them apologized to me and told me, it was a trip. I've never been to that part of the world. I just looked at it as, I'm going to try and help. But after a while, I didn't know it was hurting the cause. See, I don't think they knew what they were being used for. And for me, I think I explained to a few of those gentlemen that went on the trip, you're from a different society. You're not from that society. I'm not from that society. And even though I am and have been here and there the chairman of this tribe, then you deal with things at a different level and you respect those leaders of that society. Not the government, that society within your tribe. And those laws, I think, are the ones that they also looked at it and said, you're absolutely right. I don't belong to that society. So that's how we kind of figured that. But even then, I think by the museum's own words in Canada, and thank you everybody that set that meeting up, and we had that beautiful day there. And by the way, I had never been to Canada myself, and I was impressed with the power of the totem poles and the beams and all that of the people of the North, people that have dealt with a lot of preservation and things of trying to survive there. I call it the coal country. And for us, I think here in the South, some of those things probably added to them trying to get to a decision or a path, I would say. But I think that's what they had done to us. And for us, I think to this day, that's why I thank Andrea and everybody in the Maaso Kova committee, because now we've become even closer and brothers on protecting not only the Maaso Kova, but the other societies themselves. And I belong, to this day, I belong to the soldier society, which is the tropa, they call it, or to me, my grandfather, I'm about a third or fifth generation of that ceremonial group, or tropa as it's called, or a society. And to this day, I teach a lot of the youngsters that are coming in a lot of the ancient ways, and you know, whether it's what a museum try to do, or how did they treat us and all that. I just think that, to this day, I just look at, if it wasn't for everybody that's on this panel, and even the Repatriation Organization Committee, even the UN trying, I think we would never get to this point, and I think we are. So thanks.
I can add one thing, because I think, to generalize what Peter just very correctly said, one of the things they tried was divide and conquer, and they had ticket money to get. We are the group of cultural leaders that we work with refused to go unless it was to actually get the Maaso Kova back. They wanted us to be in, films about the Maaso Kova. Say no, we can't do that. I mean, it was really quite underhanded and quite upsetting, and they did try with ticket money and all that stuff to set up a divide and conquer, bring people and their conclusion was, oh no, the Maaso Kova can stay in the museum here. It was, pretty sneaky but pretty obvious, but they saw it wasn't going to work, because we were working with the traditional authorities and the traditional cultural leaders from both sides, and they weren't going for that at all. And in our way, you have to be authorized to go and speak. It's a pretty strict protocol. So, none of that happened. But one thing that they did do, when they understood that it was not possible, how they said these two women anthropologists acquired it, they stopped saying that it was gifted to them. They stopped saying, that they got it, through a legitimate way. They just kind of stopped talking about how they got it at all, and just went to the fact that they have it. But anyway, yeah, that's some things to watch out for. Is when you're getting close, they're going to go with their money and do a divide and conquer end run. It didn't work at the end of the day, and some pretty bad things happened as a result of what they did. I don't know if they accept internal responsibility for that, and Peter knows what I'm talking about. But there were some pretty bad results for messing with our culture like that, and it didn't work. At the end of the day, they had to come around and talk to the real people.
Thank you both. I appreciate you answering that question, and thank you for your due diligence and for your hard work. To all of our panelists, it is the end of our time together here tonight. So I just want to say thank you to all three of you. This has been a wonderful panel.
Everything back.